I think we are live. Great. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Improbable Noise, a multi-level account of randomness and unpredictability. We're here with Inigo Wilkins. This seminar develops a multi-level account of noise, exploring the associated notion of randomness and unpredictability across different disciplinary contexts. This will include its scientific conception in information theory and cybernetics, and its relation to thermodynamics, dynamic systems theory, evolutionary biology, and complexity theory. It will show how noise can be understood within a functionalist, computationalist, philosophical framework, drawing on Hume and Kant via Sellers's inferentialist account of reason, and elaborating its pertinence to the project of artificial general intelligence. It will examine the dynamics underlying the neurophenomenological experience of noise and how it is understood within the predictive processing architecture postulated by contemporary cognitive science. We'll then look at how noise can be understood in economic theory before exploring the particularly sonic aspect of noise and its use in music. The aim is to demystify noise, to counter the new liberal politics of self-organizing randomness and the tendency to fetishize indeterminacy in contemporary art, by showing how constrained randomness is intrinsic to the functional organization of complex dynamic systems, including higher cognition, and how the navigation of noise is a necessary condition of reason and consequently of freedom. The seminar is being taught by Inigo Wilkins, who took his master's in sonic culture at the University of East London and completed his PhD in cultural studies at Goldsmith in 2016. The title of his thesis was Irreversible Noise, the Rationalization of Randomness and the Fetishization of Indeterminacy, which he is now transforming into a book for a forthcoming publication by Urbanomic. He is a co-director of Glassbeat. So here we are with Inigo, and I'm going to pass the mic to him to begin the seminar. Go ahead.
Okay. Should we start by kind of just introducing a little bit, because I don't know some of you, and it'd be nice to know what your interests or what particularly drew you to this course.
It's your seminar, and you can conduct it if you deem necessary to get the introduction. That would be the most appropriate thing to do. So
I think so. Just to hear, just very briefly from each one of you, what's your kind of interest in this, and then I'll get on with an introduction, and we can go from there. So
maybe we can start from. Maybe we can start from Tegan. If Tegan, you can hear us, you can start. But if you're not there, maybe Sepida, why don't you do it? Your mic is on.
Okay. Hi. This is Sepida, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Architecture, and I teach architecture studios and parametric design and morphology. So I'm really interested in this subject. Somehow work with the whole process that's happening also within the architecture. So that's why I'm here.
Okay.
Tegan, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. My name's Tegan. I guess I write. I was a musician for almost 10 years, so anything involving noise is pretty interesting to me. Yeah, that's about all I have to say.
Martin,
Okay,
Martin,
no worries.
go next.
Yeah, I consider myself a cultural historian of the concept of the scientific concept of emergence across, and its influence on philosophy and art since 1900, really since Bergson and Poincaré all the way up. and actually finished my dissertation in 1990 under a guy named William R. Paulson, who wrote the book The Noise of Culture, a really wonderful book, profoundly influential. And I also play music. Currently, I'm writing about the cognitive neuroscience of jazz improvisation. So that's where I am right now.
Right.
John Michael, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. I actually go by Ian. I am an attorney, and I just sort of wander the internet, trying to pick up philosophically, sort of inspired topics, just expanding perspectives. So I can't claim any particular background in this material, but the course description sounded intriguing. So here I am.
Great.
Greg? You're mute. If you can unmute yourself from above the screen. There's a little button up there. If you go and you can unmute yourself. If you move the mouse on the screen in the Hangout, on the very top there's a microphone, the third icon from the left, and you click it and you can speak. If it doesn't work, let's do Eduardo, and then I'll see if I can unmute you. Eduardo, why don't you go ahead?
I'm Eduardo. I'm a filmmaker from Mexico City. I'm interested in experimental documentary, so sound is always really important. And I'm also interested and organize experimental electronic music gigs here. So that's it.
Great.
Greg, did you figure it out? If you see the window of, if the microphone button up there is not red and it's already clear, that means you have, your sound card is somehow involved with another app and you can't use the mic. So one of the ways to do it is to quit everything and leave and come back. And then at some point you can introduce yourself. I'm gonna just speak a few words to Ian and say, Ian, you picked the right class for what you were looking for. It's just amazing that we end up with people like you, because Inigo is really knowledgeable in what he's talking about. And we've been kind of colleagues and friends for over I don't know, 3-4 years, and belonging to the same community of people. Same also with Martin here. He's been a supporter of New Center and part of many of our seminars in the last 4 years. We all almost entering the 5th year of our existence as an institution. So yeah, so I'm super looking forward, and we're also very much looking forward to the book, because actually what started our conversation was the fact that we've all been waiting for the book to come out, because Inigo's dissertation at Goldsmith has been very promising and very important in exploring this topic. So yeah, so I don't know, maybe he can update us also at some point about how's the book coming along. But I think before taking too much of the time, I'm gonna let him begin the class. Also, Inigo, I think your internet is a little bit slow, so I don't know what we can do about it, but maybe not in this session, but I want to work with you to find ways to speed your internet up. One ways to do it maybe would be to go on top of your screen and then maybe adjust your band usage to maybe a little bit lower, go very low, not go super low, because then we lose your video, right? But if you go very low, I think it just adjusts it for your internet speed for this session, and your video quality will go down, but your sound will be good. Do you see it? It's right next to the video icon on the top. Pardon me?
Adjust bandwidth, right? Okay.
Yeah, adjust bandwidth. Go to very low.
Got it.
Yeah, just go to very low.
So,
yeah, bring it down to very low.
how's that?
Yeah, because I think that way the video quality will be compromised, but your voice won't be compromised so much. And then maybe we work out a way to see if we can speed you up for the next session. Now,
All right.
yeah, it's better actually.
Okay,
Greg, do you want to try to introduce yourself? Unmute. You're still
It's
mute.
not working.
No, you can't. Okay, your microphone's
No
broken.
worries.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
We'll introduce another time. Okay. Okay, so let's get started then, because there's plenty to say. So yeah, as Mo was saying a little bit on my PhD, and then I've been turning it into a book. It's been quite a while that I've been revising it into the book because it covers such a big array, and it keeps on. You know, there's a lot of possibility for shifting around, and so revision to what it's going to be for the book from what it was in the PhD. But anyway, let me just kind of do like a. I mean, obviously, it's pretty huge, the book, so I'm going to give you like a compressed kind of to the main, and I guess I probably shift it towards the sound and music side of it as much as possible, because that seems the general. Although, of course, I'm going to go through the other stuff as well because it's necessary. So yeah, I'll just start off with kind of introducing kind of the main idea or the basis of what we're gonna do. So, and part of that, okay. So this has to do with. Let me just say, basically, I got into to researching noise a long time ago through sound, so through sonic culture, and I was really kind of disappointed with a lot of the sonic culture textbooks that dealt with the concept of noise. So what I've been trying to work on is to kind of deal effectively with the scientific ideas of noise, and to kind of bring that up to the social level of analysis without kind of destroying either part of them. So yeah, I think, you know, the problem of noise is like it's just such a it's concept. It travels across so many different disciplines that it's often kind of misunderstood in one area and applied to other areas. Kind of I guess like at the basis there you got kind of a qualitative conception of noise that's related to kind of, say, for example, like subjective, whether you like, and then a quantitative kind of conception, say, right? And you know, generally you get kind of either, you know, you get these two kind of poles, which I want to. One would be like castigating the quantitative side, which is like a typical move in the humanities. And so the sound studies texts do this, so they kind of brush information theory aside, and then on the other side you've got elimination of the qualitative, especially in kind of ruthless reductionism. So yeah, I think, I mean, again, from the big perspective, what I wanted to say is just that with the start of this, it's not about answering the kind of metaphysical question, what is noise? And this is exactly what Mazzola says in his book on the topos of noise, topos of music as well. So instead of the ramified path structure of the concept of noise. Okay, so the concept of noise travels through, has a rich semantic complexity in the pathways that it travels, and that's what we want to try to do, is to travel through those. So basically, the contemporary kind of concept of noise is computational one in theory, and it developed with the rise of information and information communication technologies. Transition that completely changed a lot, you know, so massive effects on social and cultural. But there was several hundred years of philosophical, scientific, and mathematical developments that prepared the way for this. Suddenly, this popped out of nowhere, right? So,
Inigo, I'm going to interrupt you. Listen,
yeah.
the sound is really like breaks down. So maybe this class, and I apologize to everyone, we can just shut the video down and go very low. So at least we try to get a better sound recording, because it's the first seminar and it's important for people to kind of like on this. I was just waiting for the quality to go higher a bit, but it just doesn't. So if you can kindly go all the way down to very low, audio only. Go to audio only, and hopefully that will take care of it, because it just all the bandwidth will go to sound. And it's funny that the day we're starting the noise class, this has to happen, but it just right. So with apologies, I'm sure everybody agrees that hearing him is more important than seeing him and hearing him with interruptions, right? So apologies to that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh,
and we'll definitely fix it.
How does that? Does that working? Is that working better?
You just have to keep going, and then we'll see. If it is awful, I'll let you know.
Okay. So do I need to recap the stuff that I just said already, or?
Let's see what people think. Do you guys think Inigo should recap a little bit, or it's good? I could understand what you're saying, but I'm just assuming that like it might be hard for other people to sort of like enter the discussion with this kind of like breakdown of the sound. So I don't see any messages coming on the side. People say they were following along.
You might want to recapitulate how you're going to balance the science of information theory and cybernetics with the aesthetics of noise, and then also mention the economics again. Just try to explain what the balance is.
Yeah.
For this particular episode that you're going to cover today, not the entire seminar, but just what you're going to cover today.
Sure. I'm gonna go through that today. So yeah, I'll explain that as we go along. Don't worry. Okay. So yeah. So the all I was just saying is that the kind of, you know, the concept of, it's got many different kind of interpretations, and you know, I guess like the main thing will be, like, if you're the studies text will just say, oh well, noise is subjective, and then, you know, and then we've got you know, scientific conceptions with kind of quantitative ones. I think those can be both joined up according to a kind of relativity to theoretical, but I'm going to explain that as we go on. So yeah, just at the end of that, there was this, so this contemporary idea of noise for by several hundred years of developments in philosophy and science and mathematics, right? So the pre-modern conception was generally characterized by fatalism and a submission to chance in the form of fortune, right? Where the construction of a calculus which enabled a statistical prediction and control of randomness in the form of risk was an essential factor in the transition to modernity and the birth of capitalism. So this probabilistic conception of random, also the basis for many of the important discoveries of modern science, notably thermodynamics, evolutionary theory, and the explanation of matter in terms of stochastic movement of atomic particles. Okay, so this is why kind of I called my book or my pierceable noise, because of the relationship there to thermodynamics and to the passage of time. So there's a, you know, the conception of time is a geometric one. So there's a kind of global asymmetry that causes the direction, the arrow of time to go in that direction. This is also kind of, you can think of this in kind of modal terms. So thermodynamics it gives you that arrow of time is a necessary one, whereas statistical mechanics revises this into a probabilistic one. We're going to get into the details of that later. So there's a kind of precise computational description in statistical mechanics where of this arrow of time, where macroscopic properties such as temperature or equilibrium result from the probability distribution of an ensemble of microstates. So, and this means that disorder is a phenomenon whose definition is dependent on the scale of analysis. Okay, so one of the texts I've added onto the Google Drive there is the one by Uno, which is called Nonlinear World, and he gives there a definition of noise. He says noise can be defined as unpredictable and uncontrollable perturbations coming from outside the scales that we can directly observe. So this is therefore related to this linear kind of exponential effects that lead to critical transitions. But probability and randomness are also the basis of political economy and the surge in speculative financial investments from the 17th century. Okay, so this is how, you know, that I'm linking those two ideas there. Then there's a kind of rational understanding of chance that develops through this, and alongside the understanding of mechanistic understanding of phenomena. Momentous repercussions for modern philosophy in terms of the understanding of freedom and determinism and so forth. So this is a kind of thoroughgoing conceptual revolution, which is equally art and music, as well as and economics. So one of my main kind of start by nature is called chance, silence, noise. I've also put that in the drive, which is basically a hyperstatization of chance in what he calls popular French epistemology. And his targets there are people like Serre, Prigogine, and so forth. So I'll come back to him. The point here, you know, his critique is based on the idea of the relativity of randomness to theoretical framework. But then I just want to explain a little bit about why I've put kind of econ music as the kind of this here. So first, both econ fundamentally mathematical, and both of them have been profoundly affected by the developments of modern science. The contemporary concept of noise has unavoidable political and aesthetic dimensions that bound conceptual navigation between order and disorder and freedom and necessity. Lastly, music and economics, like the concept of noise, require a multi-level analysis that is able to account for physical, chemical, and unconscious information processing, conceptually suffused perception, and rational consciousness, the multi-level I'm talking about. And probably kind of most of you know of this book by Jacques Attali, Noise: A Political Economy, and really I guess what I'm trying to write is a kind of counter proposal to Attali's account. So most of the kind of humanities accounts, the part of the problem is that they pose this kind of primacy of experience, scientific description. That's one problem. Another problem is when they characterize noise as resistance and as excess in opposition to order. Right? Noise is, I mean, in every case, noise is a kind of equivocal hero, right? So it's like it's always got this kind of this side of resistance and excess, at the same time as association with the Industrial Revolution, the horrors of total warfare, the development of instrumental rationality. It's a signifier of horror. It's a leitmotif of modernity, abstraction, alienation, rupture with nature, and the loss of foundations. Right. So this is the kind of equivocal, kind of ambiguous basis of it. Right. So randomness, chaos, and uncertainty are often posed as undermining reason or representation. But my argument is, on the contrary, we can think of the elaboration of the understanding of randomness, chaos, and uncertainty as the outstanding achievement of scientific rationality. So we have to reject the idea of noise as resistance on the basis that there's been a widespread and domestication of randomness and noise through technologies of prediction and control. So it's no longer enough to assert resistance in the form of noise. What we need to transform rather than to resist. And it's necessary to reconceptualize rather than to denounce it. And my contention is that noise is as intrinsic to reason in the positive as it is to cognition and to the revisionary constructive elaboration of freedom. So I think the problem with these other accounts of noise is they fail to recognize the kind of multi-scale complexity of noise and the intrinsically functional relationship that it plays within these different levels. So biological, social, political, economic systems, as well as its role in music and other activities of reason. So I think like these other accounts of noise, which I'm trying to get away from, the problem in a way is Chatelet's book To Live and Think Like Pigs. He talks about the uptick that makes self-organizing randomness and perturbations below the threshold of measurement the wellspring of freedom and creativity against the rational description of systems in terms of mechanistic determinism. I think that, this is the kind of it's this bit botched dialectic that I want to kind of overturn here, and countering what Chatelet calls this pseudo-libertarian imposture of chaos demands a reconceptualization of the relationship between reason and randomness that resists the temptation to hyperstatize chance and exalt noise. So, so yeah, I mean, one of the texts I really recommend reading is the already, which is very short and easy to read. But I mean, there's more or less kind of, I'm in more or less agreement with him, but I think there's kind of certain problems as well. And I think, you know, for example, Giuseppe Longo, I've talked to him about this. I mean, he thinks that Tom has got a kind of a Platonistic conception of nature, and really, like, this comes out, and he says kind of the illegitimate use of chance begins with Darwinism, and so I think there's certain problems with his account, but what I is the negation of randomness that he starts from. So this is the idea that randomness is that which fictional formal description. So it explains that the capacity for the latter for formative relation, and this is particularly true for hierarchically organized systems, social systems, thinking systems, and so on. So there's a kind of you know, there's this semantic complexity of noise, right? Which is, you know, the term noise, obviously, it's a natural language idea that precedes the scientific use of noise, the developed concept of noise. And so you could take it this way and just criticize the scientific appropriation of noise and say, oh, well, there's a, you know, the looser kind of cultural understanding of noise is the more pertinent one. But I think, you know, I think you can kind of positively take kind of the ambiguity in terms of, I mean, this is what Ray Brazier phrased when he talked about noise. He said it has a strategic. So, and this is similar to the words like cell, energy, code, function, and levels, right? The use of these words in science, they're appropriated from natural language, and their ambiguity is a positive boon to their then scientific use, right? But it's also a problem because that ambiguity, that multi-use terms, means that sometimes people will misunderstand the usage from one level or one level of description and apply it to another level of description, right? So if you, this is referring to Craver's text, which is also in the folder there. It's a text called Levels, where he describes, again, how the word levels has got a huge amount of meanings and is used in different areas of science, and often these get confused, but we don't need to give up on that ambiguity of that term. We need to kind of use it in a positive way, right? So noise is, you know, on Tom's account of noise, it's a relativistic kind of, but it doesn't follow that mean that it's just subjective, as the sound studies text would have it, right? And I don't think, you know, it's enough to kind of claim that noise just has a relational ontology, which is what one sound studies text puts it, which is ontology of noise, towards an ontology of noise. You know, what we need to do is explain kind of how, you know, what are the ethical and ontological criteria noise at different levels. So we need to be able to understand how noise can be both a subjective phenomenon at the same time as having mind-independent objective existence, while in either case always being defined relative to a theoretical framework. In order to do that, we need to develop a naturalized account of perception and cognition. So, you know, obviously, a naturalization is a tricky thing. So we must have the kind of courage to avoid the kind of sloppy romantic idealism that strives to conserve the inherited image of nature or to legitimate the current socio-political status, crossing it off as natural, and the kind of perspicuity to challenge the kind of brutally reductive, natural, subsume everything under a kind of overarching set of physical laws. And laws would then be, I think it's pure ideology when these get extended up to cognitive and social systems. And so here I'm just riffing off actually Negustani Reza's on the Lobster Man on Jordan Peterson, where he talks about greedy naturalization there, and it, you know, I think as he says, it's an aspect of nature that doesn't allow you to move upwards towards the autonomy of reason and downward towards the heteronomy of causes, then, you know, you're going to end up in the kind of ideological misunderstandings that Peterson finds himself in. So in order to have a kind of decent naturalism, I think you know, Wilfrid Sellers is a useful resource and a good starting point. And there's a great book on Sellers which serves as an excellent introductory text if you don't know Sellers so well, which is where he describes Sellers in terms of a naturalism with a normative twist. So is that there's the causal reducibility of perception and cognition to its physical structures and properties, but that doesn't prevent one from also maintaining the logical irreducibility of the normative linguistic coordination of cognition, action, and perception to lower level causal processes. Okay, so causal reducibility come logical irreducibility. So the autonomy of reason is thus formal rather than substantive. So we don't need to postulate a substance or mechanistic explanation, right? This can be cashed out in terms of count of the forms of organization or the enabling constraints necessary and sufficient to realize sapient cognition. For our purposes is to show that randomness and noise are intrinsic to such an account, and that specifying their functional role in such systems avoids succumbing either to their anti-scientific veneration or to their... Okay, so all going okay? Any questions so far? Somebody asked what's the title. All good. Okay. I'm going to carry on then. Okay, so the modern science from Copernicus.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It seems to me that one moment that's central to all this work is the moment when people realized that the mathematics which undergirds the explanation of intrinsic random systems and thermodynamics also applies to the transmission of information through channels. And that insight, the fact that the mathematics works in both areas, enables you to talk about probability and noise in the world, in the physical world, in the natural world, and in the realm of human communication. So it seems like you're trying to naturalize communication. And I think that's a really, really important point. But can you provide examples of how that happens so that we can get a picture of why this was like a major moment in our scientific understanding of the relationship between the natural sciences and things like, you know, telephones and computers and so forth?
Well, oh, I'm getting feedback now. Oh, that's because your microphone is probably on, Martin.
I fixed it.
Yeah, good. So, well, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure I can kind of bring examples off of the top of my head, and it's gonna be there's a number of different kind of yeah, I mean,
I don't know what happened.
there's a whole kind of string of like of mathematical developments that lead the development of a probability, right? Well, I mean, let's say kind of like the law of large numbers and the principle of least action, and these are the kind of first kind of parts of that picture, right? Which lead to the kind of capacity to understand probability as it's working in stuff like games, right? Gambling and so on, right? And that's applied immediately to finance. And we're going to go through that more kind of in detail when we get to the kind of finance part of it, right? Or to the economics part. In detail, each side of it when fairly soon as well. But I think, you know, is that information theory gets us to the level of, you know, or what we have now is effectively a generalization of information theory that covers practically all phenomena that can be naturalistically explained, right? And that goes up to the level of human communication. But I think, you know, the important point is that that's not going to be sufficient for describing what's happening in terms of sapient, you know, cognition, right? There, you know, information theory can give us can quantify kind of the communication channel of that communication, right? The level of noise, but it's not going to be able to describe kind of what's happening in terms of, you know, logical, conceptual, you know, meaning production, right? You know, information theory brackets that, right? And more recently, I mean, we've got kind of information theoretical understandings of meaning. But again, I think that doesn't come up to the level of providing an understanding of what's really happening in terms of semantic complexity of sapient cognition. Again, this is something I'm going to develop as we go along. Does that answer your question okay, Martin? Let's hope so. Okay.
Yes. I'm just trying to see for this general audience, what is the connection between thermodynamics and noise? I mean, it seems to me that's a really important kind of moment, and there are reasons why these two things are put together, even though they're in completely different fields. And it goes to the problem of metaphor, really, that you were talking about in terms of how noise functions in such a variety of ways that it starts to get mushy.
Yeah, totally.
But there are precise ways in which people connected entropy and noise, and I think that would be really useful. I think.
Yeah. I'm gonna talk about
that in your it seems to me that one of the things that you're trying to do is to naturalize noise.
Well, I want to give a multi-level account, right? And that's going to involve kind of giving a naturalized account of noise. But I also want to say how we need to have also a normative account, right? So one that can't be, that is logically irreducible to its naturalized description, right? So this is the kind of Salesian kind of dilemma, effectively, right? But
yeah.
And the what Sellers is trying to do is to give a synoptic image of that. But yeah, this is something I'm going to develop as we go along. And I think the for sure, like the connection between thermodynamics and noise is well, first of all, entropy, and which is the term that also information theory uses. Right, and then cybernetics is the kind of the fulcrum between that, which is where a lot of the misunderstandings come from. But yeah, I'm going to go through that.
Okay.
So
sorry.
That's okay. So I'm just going to continue with this kind of like introduction through kind of modern science, right? So the discoveries of modern science from Copernicus onwards can be thought as representing successive waves in the collapse of a nature. Physics of necessity are progressively replaced by rationalization of probability. So, as I was saying earlier, you got this kind of pre-modern conception of chance related to the divine, and then modernity is characterized by a turn towards the kind of mechanistic and statistical probabilistic understanding of nature. So,
sorry, is that what you identified with the Copernican turn, or because there was a moment of like breakdown, and yeah, it wasn't clear how you were relating the topic to the Copernican revolution. If you can just go over that quickly.
Okay, yeah, just that this kind of collapse of the theological dimension, the theological explanation of natural phenomena, right? So instead of having like chance occurrences as being explained by God, you get a progressive rationalization of randomness, right? And I mean, Copernicus is just a kind of the general kind of point that people point to for the beginning of modern science, right? So that was all I meant by mentioning him. And I think really like, so where I was getting up to was like this kind of so you got this modernity is characterized by a turn towards mechanistic understanding of nature, and that's which you see in Laplace. So Laplace is causal determinism, where randomness is understood to arise only as a result of epistemic limitations in the specification of boundary conditions. Right? So for Laplace, if you can specify the boundary conditions exactly, then there is no randomness. We perfectly predict everything, right? But for example, but even Laplace kind of still had this kind of theological remnant, effectively, right? So his understanding, when in trying to explain why the system didn't just collapse due to kind of random perturbations, he had to rely on God there. He said, God keeps the harmony of the solar system in check, and this is where kind of Poincaré, when he tries to solve the three-body problem, shows that that really kind of well, he shows that this is an unsolvable problem because of the fluctuations of measurement that are on the continuum, right? So you get this kind of where with Laplace you could maintain a kind of with Poincaré and understanding of the epistemic limitations for grasping that, right? Then, in the 20th century, you get quantum mechanics, for example, and you get this turn towards an understanding of nature, at least stochastic. So where deterministic laws are reconceived as probabilistically valid pragmatic idealizations. But I think, as I put in also the Dropbox there, Judea Pearl's first two chapters on his book in Causality, and there he argues that the stochastic conception of nature, impoverished understanding, explanatory traction on the causal structure of processes and events. And in particular, he explains that you can't define counterfactuals. So, for example, if you assume a fully stochastic, fully random, then statements such as like the probability of X occurring because of Y is high. Is Y not being the case? The probability of X occurring would be low. These kind of statements kind of lose, right? So you have to kind of assume some level of mechanistic determination. Complex phenomena like biological systems, there you have nonlinear effects such that the exhaustive description of those mechanisms becomes computationally exorbitant, right? You can't. But nevertheless, we have to assume some kind of deterministic processes are involved. But yeah, this is kind of fast forwarding a bit. I'm going to kind of go back again. So yeah, let's take this kind of philosophically speaking. You got, after the kind of Cartesian split between mind and body, there's the problematic knot concerning the relationship between randomness, mechanistic determinism, and freedom was developed by Leibniz, Hume, and Kant. I just mentioned those because these are the people I will be talking about to some degree. So all three of these philosophers can be understood as reacting to the new mechanistic explanation of the sublunar and supralunar world under the same universal laws. And this is where it relates to Copernicus again, right? And attempting to account for the apparent irreducibility of the intelligible or the sense-mechanical explanation. So if we explain everything, if we explain natural phenomena in terms of their mechanical laws, how can we understand sensation, the sensibility and intelligibility, right? This is the question that these philosophers were grappling with. So it's in the 20th century that this kind of quandary, this problem, is compounded significance of information and noise. And their conceptual pairing is an inaugural moment of the late modern perspective. So the philosophical critique of mechanistic causality is most strongly developed in philosophy, where the conceptual nexus that we can call irreversible noise becomes central to a new metaphysics. And this could be said to begin with, or at least characterized by Bergson's kind of anti-mechanistic conception of lived experience or as duration. So Bergson's anti-representationalist account of temporality is in particular directed against the fundamentally reversible picture of the world implied by the Newtonian conception of force, the absolute predictability of Laplacian determinism, and the atomic reductionism of Boltzmann. So his vitalist thesis is that conscious force is irreversible, non-quantifiable, and irreducible to any spatializing representation. So this exaltation of life against intellection, mechanism, and representation is extended across other disciplinary contexts precisely through the semantic indeterminacy and multi-conceptual nature of the concepts of chaos, turbulence, and noise, notably by Michel Serres and in the Anglophone reception of Gilles Deleuze. So a metaphysics of chance comes to replace necessity. And I think, Meillassoux is somehow like the apogee of this, right? His diagnosis of correlation, it represents a significant departure from this tradition, but the metaphysics of chance that is its kind of rumbling core reaches its zenith here, I think, in the hyper chaos where contingency reigns absolute. So yeah, I'm not going to kind of give a critique of this. I think Serres, Deleuze, and Bergson did great work, and my point here is just to start from a different starting point.
Inigo, I have a question. Also,
Yeah.
I want to say that you've kind of turned the videos off, so our upstream of video to your system doesn't slow you down further. So that's why the video is off, because that way we can kind of save on the data, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is to establish back a kind of link to between sonic noise and sort of this abstract philosophical noise, which actually, as you pointed out, it's linked to the ideas of probability and chance.
Mm-hmm.
How do we account for so basically what sonic noise is? Sonic noise at its phenomenological level is basically the inability of sense perception, right? Basically, it comes down to the inability of sense perception to sort of deal with the multi-level complexity of the incoming information. Is that?
Yeah, in some way. I mean, I think there's there's several levels of description are possible here. So I don't think there's one way of understanding noise or sonic noise even, right? So you can give for example, you can give you can kind of quantify noise in for example physics terms. You can give a kind of an understanding of it in phenomenological terms, then and you can talk about it in semantic terms, and they're all different, right? So I think you're right. The general, for me, the most important way that we would understand that is in terms of the let's say information excess, right? But I think if we say that that's what it is, then you miss some of the other aspects, right? But for sure, this is it's still related or still understandable in terms of randomness, unpredictability, and so forth. Those same terms which we're trying to understand noise in now.
You also said something about sort of like looking at noise at different resolutions and how that changes. If you can elaborate on that also, would be really, really nice, because it really captured my mind, that little bit of discussion.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I think what probably you're referring to this part where talking about nonlinearity and how, so noise is a scale relative to your scale of analysis or your theoretical framework, right? So, for example, if you got if you've got if you're looking at some kind of turbulent dynamics, there'll be the microscopic kind of interactions that are going on, maybe kind of relatively ordered or relatively random, and at some point most of those effects are not going to kind of bubble up to the surface of macroscopic observable phenomena, right? So this is what I mean. Uno talks about this very nicely. So most of those those random effects are not going to be to kind of surface up to the observable level, and the ones that do so in a kind of in a way that can be predicted, right? So, and at least there are ways in which we can understand, there are mathematics that enable us to do that, right, for certain systems, right? But that works in kind of in physics terms. But when we're looking at kind of nonlinear effects in social systems, then that's something different. So you're not going to be able to apply the same mathematics there, right? But you've still got that kind of scale effect where things that were irrelevant at the micro level, right, suddenly become relevant at the macro level.
Thank you. What you said and what you just reiterated remind me of a very, very basic visual example in digital pictures. Like, say, if you zoom in and look at a bunch of pixels, it looks very noisy, but you have to like zoom out, and then all of a sudden the picture come into focus, right? But if you look at it at a certain scale, you only see noise, like pixelated noise.
Totally, yeah. So this is why like noise is really very much defined by scale effects. But scale effects are one thing, but then there's also theoretical framework as well. So something's going to be noise according to how you're what it is you're interested in understanding and how you're understanding it, right? I mean, say in music, I mean, this is kind of, that would be the obvious example. If your theoretical framework is, you're a classical musician who's only listened to Beethoven, then then throbbing gristle is going to be noise to you. But if you're if you've got a different theoretical framework, things are going to appear noise, right? This takes it up to the subjective kind of level or aesthetic level.
Great example.
So yeah, just lots of these kind of outcomes of modern science, right? So nonlinear dynamics, Gödelian incompleteness, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the wave-particle duality of quantum mechanics. Often these are kind of used mostly by humanities accounts to kind of to argue that there's some kind of fundamental limitations in the capacity for the rational description of the world, right? So they're the armature of the anti-mechanistic argument. But you can argue the converse, right? You can argue that that all of these all of these kind of scientific developments can be seen as the progressive refinement of the understanding of those natural phenomena. So, we can take it completely the other way and reconceptualize what mechanism and what reason means. And I think people like Negustani, Brazier, Gabriel Catren, Andre Erzman, William Wimsatt, Carl Craver, all of these people are doing that. And one of the most kind of obvious would be Bechtel. So I put his text in the folder there, which is called Discovering Complexity, and the subtitle is Localization, Decomposition and Localization as Methods in Science. Right? So he's arguing there for a kind of dynamic mechanistic conception. Right? So it's really kind of totally is not prone to all of those kind of anti-mechanistic arguments. What he's saying is, if we want to understand, how, I mean, he's talking about cognition there, right? So if we want to understand kind of how thinking works, we can say that there is this function, for example, kind of color perception, and we look for the mechanism, that would provide that function, right? And we want to, so we decompose the complex system into its parts and try to localize those mechanistic parts in a physical part of the body, right? And his idea is that you don't kind of, if localization isn't always going to work, right? So you've got these kind of stages of where if you can't localize it in this structure, then you might be able to localize it in the combination of this structure and that structure. And if you can't localize it there, then you want to you go all the way up to kind of it being a global emergent effect, right? But nevertheless, you've still got a kind of mechanistic explanation of the functional property that you're trying to understand.
Would you also, I was going to say, would you also add Eli Ayashe to the list of people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm going to talk about Eli Ayashe's work when we get into the economics part. I think, he's certainly kind of, I think, goes a long way in kind of demystifying randomness in economics and probability. And I fundamentally agree with a lot of his arguments, although I don't go quite as far as he does. Which he takes a Mayasuian kind of absolute contingency stance, which I don't go as far as. I think he's wrong with that. But then I agree with all of his analysis of what his book is like beyond probability, right? The blank swan, and this is how I think we need to understand finance and economics.
Well, I just wanted to say for the students who are enrolled in your seminar that if most of you are able to access Ayashe's 4-session seminar he just did for us on his work, and if you're interested, you can access those videos. If you try to access them and you couldn't, let us know, and we can make sure you access them, because they're very relevant to what Inigo's doing here, and it will be interesting, especially once we get closer to the finance discussion, for you to see how he applies his own ideas to his actual practice of developing software for trading derivatives. So yeah, just a little note that we have these 4-session videos, very, very informative. And I actually participated in all the sessions, and I kind of I keep trying to relate what you're saying in the first session to some of the arguments he had. And also I think, I don't want to open an argument here, but I don't think his absolute contingency is as scary as it sounds like. If you actually see how he translated into his practice of sort of understanding the derivatives, and how basically, if I can just summarize it in a couple of sentences, if you allow me, is that for him, market becomes a place where the unpredictability of the noise is sort of like dealt with on a day-to-day basis. So the market becomes sort of like a place where this mechanistic understanding can actually take place, even though it's very reductive and mechanistic, right? As a sort of like a derivative market, or even the stock market itself.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I think his analysis of probability and randomness is absolutely correct. And I mean, I don't really have the problem that I have, I guess, with that absolutization of contingency is just because, of I guess, it works. It works in his analysis perfectly. But the problem for me would be kind of the situating the market within a wider politics, which I don't think he effectively does, right? So I think that he's speaking from within the market, and I think we need to also speak about the market from without, right?
No, absolutely, I agree with you.
Okay, so I'll continue a bit. Does anyone need a break? We're okay.
I see Martin writing a big comment on the side. I don't know if he wants to introduce it or if he meant it for us to just read it, or it would be great if Martin wants to like basically read it or talk about it. Do you want to, Martin, or should we just let it sit there as is?
I just unmuted myself. I'm trying to figure out ways, because I think I mean, I'm really have been fascinated by this topic for a really long time, and I'm trying to find ways to enable the conversation to both cover a range of different disciplinary contexts, while at the same time grounding it in something other than casual metaphor. So so there's a couple of things that that would make it more accessible, and that is basically talking about deterministic systems versus probabilistic systems in physics and the role of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you want to get into economics and politics, the Industrial Revolution is built on taking deterministic laws in order to control thermodynamic processes in order to produce work. But there's a moment like in the late 19th century with Boltzmann where the threat to that order, the nice order of the Industrial Revolution exemplified by the machine in its perfect working order, is that machines break down. And there are two reasons why machines don't work efficiently. One has to do with inefficiency, that the separation of cold and hot in a heat engine eventually dissipates, and the machine becomes less efficient because it depends upon that temperature gradient in order to generate power. And then the other element of how the machinery of the Industrial Revolution breaks down is that it starts to disintegrate. The form of entropy in the form of rust, in the form of waste, both material and human waste of resources, all figure into the inefficiencies of this war of control of deterministic systems, exemplified by your reference to Laplace, and the intrinsic randomness, which people like Carnot, Clausius, Maxwell, and Boltzmann were trying to come to terms with. But it was Boltzmann who came up with a notion that that entropy is not just an end game where the Ferrari will turn into a pile of rust, but the pile of rust can never remember what it's like to be a Ferrari again. But he talked about the fact that there's a possibility open, a window open, where a system under the influence of the first law of thermodynamics could possibly move in the direction towards orderliness. In other words, and that moment becomes a window into which Poincaré and Bergson jump in with both feet. And the influence of that one moment is so enormous that it influences the entire avant-garde, beginning with Duchamp, who read them both very carefully. This is like my original work, and so here we're moving from the physics of intrinsic random systems and the attempts to control that, right? Where noise or entropy is a threat to the functioning of the system through rust, right? Much like human beings are a threat to the functioning of capitalism because of their own willingness to exert their individual needs against that of the system. And it seems to me that the narrative of noise in the context of control and freedom is contextualized in the physical sciences in this way. And then I mentioned, Shannon as someone who takes Boltzmann's order principle and applies it to information, and literally to enable to measure the amount of noise in an information channel, without initial regard to an interest in noise in itself, except as a threat to the flow of information. Did that make sense?
Totally, yeah, exactly. I completely agree, and I think, though, I think that what we see now is basically from, and this is something I'm going to talk about later in more detail, but we've moved from the the paradigm in the early 20th century. Information theory and cybernetics was one of robustness to noise. Noise has to be minimized as much as possible, and now we moved into a system when noise is kind of exploited instead. So which is a predictive system, right? So based on predictive control, and I think that completely changes the situation. But I completely agree with you on it there. Yeah, and it's very interesting how that relates to Duchamp and so on.
Yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. I was just basically trying to ground it in specific examples of where the science connects, historically and mathematically. Totally.
Yeah. No, and I'm going to talk more about Shannon and Boltzmann in more specific detail as we go on. But yeah, I mean, so really at the moment, I'm still just trying to kind of give you a general kind of overview of the philosophical kind of problem as I see it in terms of this kind of argument, let's say, or these kind of polar problems, which I talked about in the beginning, where you've got kind of like say a kind of reductionism on the one hand and irreductionism on the other hand, like a critique of mechanism on one hand and a mechanistic reductionism on the other, right? So how do we navigate between those? And
the need to form a new kind of mathematics that can account for that.
Totally.
Yeah.
So,
okay. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just was struggling with your account and trying to put in the context which would doesn't sacrifice the the abstract theory, but anchors in specific historical moments and specific kinds of technologies,
Yeah.
specific problems in the math. I think that might be really useful. I think at this.
Helpful, thanks. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, I think okay, just back to like this. Okay, so the argument I've been put forward from Tom, right? His claim is that randomness is relative to your theoretical framework, right? But then this kind of the problem on the side of the, understand as a kind of fetishization of indeterminacy and noise. When we can't overcome that by just referring to Tom's kind of claim, right, that randomness is relative to the theoretical framework, because the mystification of noise is bound up with a pseudo-libertarian affirmation of perspectival relativity, right? So we can't just say, there's a problem in saying it's relative to theoretical framework, because they're just, a lot of those humanities accounts will just go, yes, it's all relative, and therefore subjective, right? What bad accounts do would be to kind of effectively flatten that relativity onto like a generalized subjectivity. So, and another problem here is that it could be argued that Tom has just a merely epistemological understanding of randomness and can't think its ontological scope. But I think I think this is mistaken. The argument is that any talk of randomness presupposes the definition of a frame of reference or a context and a language and a means of representation. So this is a quote from his little piece there. It says, any discussion on the theme of chance versus determinism must begin with an examination of the languages and formalisms which permit making a phenomenon the object of a realm of knowledge. This kind of approach is also corroborated in Crutchfield's computational mechanics. The measure of disorder is relative to the descriptive tools employed and the specification of the language which it's intended to observe, right? So you can, again, there's the point here is that saying that it's relative to theoretical framework isn't just like going to kind of dissolve any of those of that scientific rigor, right? The rigor is all there, and the different mathematical frameworks, different kind of scientific theoretical frameworks, understandings, different pinpoint noise at different levels, right? So for me, the problem is with most of those humanities accounts is that they'll generally take the form of an implicit assumption from which an epistemological conclusion is drawn, right? So for them, this would be like, they would say like randomness and noise exist ontological, and therefore we cannot have certain knowledge. But Tom's argument is the reverse. He begins with the epistemological definition of randomness and draws an ontological conclusion from it. So what he does is he affirms the ultimate describability of nature in principle and thereby denies the hyperstatization of chance. Okay? So we should explain the first horn of it, the first horn of this argument, because it's liable to misinterpretation. So the rational claim is not that there's no fundamental limits to knowledge. On the contrary, modern rationality is predicated on the acknowledgement of formal limits to knowledge. Gödelian incompleteness describes certain limits for mathematics, and Turing's halting problem transposes this to computability. importantly, these are not just provisional limits for us, but absolute and universal limits. So the point is that there's not something like two parts of nature, one which is knowable and the other which is forever cloaked in mystery. There are intrinsic limits to knowability that can be rationally grasped, but unless we're going to totally relinquish any notion of science, there's no enchanted or supernatural realm extrinsic to scientific rationality that would be immune to description or explanation. So I would kind of rephrase Tom's negative ontological claim by a positive assertion that any specific or scale relative appearance of randomness or noise, there are no a priori fundamental limitations to its description or scientific understanding at another scale or within another theoretical framework. So to understand noise, then we need to do more than just to postulate its ontological existence or point to putatively fundamental epistemological limits. It has to be rather explained in terms of its capacity to describe the underlying dynamics of the appearance of randomness at multiple scales and contexts. So this is why a multi-scale, multi-contextual understanding of noise is necessary. So as I've already kind of pointed to, there's like, you know, two basic distinctions there that we've already talked about. You know, microscopic realm of relatively stable appearances and the random movement of microscopic particles, right? So two scale levels, right? But secondly, there's another distinction between this description of the world according to natural language and its description according to mathematics. And for Tom, you know, according to Tom, noise is relative to descriptive capacity, and these are the only two means of description that are at our disposal. Right? So we can either describe something in mathematics or natural language. And again, these two basic distinctions, right, between macroscopic, microscopic, and natural language mathematics coincide to a considerable degree, because natural language generally refers to the experiential content of a possible manifest world, right? What appears to us at the macroscopic level. And the random movement of microscopic particles is not available to sensory experience, but is defined by mathematics, for example, statistical probabilities, right? So since modernity, mathematics has become increasingly capable of describing those aspects of the world that were hitherto restricted to natural language, leading to disenchantment and ungrounding of the associated classical conceptions. So this dispelling of the illusions of natural language facilitated by the greater descriptive power of mathematics, of irreversible events that have been referred to, that Guerrino Mazzola talks about as breakdowns of equals, right? So from geocentricity to anthropocentricity, Darwin, chronocentricity, Einstein, and ratiocentricity, Turing. So for example, I mean, in natural language, we refer to the sun rising and setting, where the Copernican revolution gives a mathematical redescription of this appearance in terms of the orbits of the solar system. So the overarching tendency of these disenchantments is that what appeared static and stable was revealed to be dynamic and unstable, right? But, you know, as I've kind of been trying to say, I think this is the triumph of rational description of natural phenomena and not its breakdown, right? So the extraordinary success of mathematical description in modern science led to an expectation that all natural phenomena would be precisely explainable in mathematical language, rendering natural language kind of obsolete. This is the kind of, you know, idea of eliminative materialism, also ruthless reductionism, and it's kind of, Tom talks about it as a conceit that is magnificently expressed in Laplacian determinism. You know, for many of the objects sufficiently described by natural language, a rigorous mathematical description of the Laplacian type would not only be very difficult, but also not pertinent, right? So this is because concepts of natural language, so a concept like cat or noise, denote complex equivalence classes that are not well described by specifying the position and the velocity of their molecular components. Right, so we can give, if you can kind of give a Laplacian kind of description of a cat, or atomic molecular description of a cat, we don't have the concept of cat, right? The concept of cat is an equivalence class, and that's never going to be described in that mathematical formalism. So, you know, and this is particularly true when we're referring to biological organisms or social level systems which don't follow predictable deterministic trajectories. So the natural language conception of noise simply can't be eliminated in favor of a kind of uncompromising mathematical description. But that doesn't mean, you know, those mathematical descriptions of noise are very helpful, right? They just don't encompass the whole of the semantic complexity of noise. So yeah, the two of the mathematical.
Can I ask a question? What would be a good example? What would be a good example of this type of unresolvable sort of like contradiction between the semantic and the mathematic? If it's possible, if not, we can just leave it for later. But I just thought maybe an example can show the inadequacy of each solely what do you call it? Solely considered on its own, and how they're basically like complementary of each other.
Yeah, I mean, well, well, the example I just put was, you know, about, you know, and this is the example that you know, the word cat, the concept of cat.
Oh, I see.
You know,
okay.
we can give a you know, you can give a kind of mathematical description of a cat, or a kind of atomic description of a cat, but it doesn't give you the concept cat, right? The concept cat, you know, is an equivalence class, so it covers also like pictures of cats, or like, you know, a cat that's a god, you know, Egyptian god or so on. And this is something you find in contemporary, you know, in AI, right? So how does like an AI understand the concept cat, right? When you can feed it like lots of images of cats, right? And, you know, of like real life cats, photographs of cats, right? But then how is it going to understand that a cartoon picture of a cat is also a cat, and, you know, a cat from this angle and a cat from that angle, you know, and a cat that's wearing a coat, and, you know, all kinds of things, right? The concept cat is very different from any kind of mathematical, you know, it's an equivalence class. This class is extraordinarily complex. You're not going to be able to kind of give an information theoretic compression of the notion of cat. And yeah, I mean, this is something I'm going to talk about this, you know, also that I'm going to develop this in terms of AI later on.
Well, thank you. I mean, not to sound like an idiot, but I thought maybe we can have like a more closer example to the concept of noise. But your cat example definitely explains the sort of like the complementary nature of these two different accounts. Yeah,
I mean, well, with noise similarly, right? It's very similar. You know, we can, you know, you can give a mathematical description of noise in information theory, for example, mathematical description of thermodynamic entropy, which has a relation to noise, but is not to be confused with it. Right? We can give a mathematical definition of acoustic noise. Right? All of these are kind of what noise is. If I say, oh, this music sounds like noise to me. The concept of noise is an equivalence class that covers a broad range of different phenomena and is a lot of different possible kind of semantically defined, logically conceptually defined equivalence. In order to kind of properly grasp what we mean by the concept of noise, I don't think you're going to have I don't think it's possible to give a complete formalist mathematical description of that.
Thank you.
Anyone else have more questions or comments, discussions here?
Maybe you can go on.
I'll go on, yeah? Okay. So I've been talking about how we got these these kind of we're talking about mathematical descriptions. There are two mathematical descriptions of disorder that are important here, and which we've already talked about, right? So Boltzmann entropy, which is thermodynamic or statistical mechanical understanding of entropy, and Shannon entropy, which is information theoretic description of noise. Right? Both of these scientific measures describe quantities of disorder that are effectively invisible or inaudible, right? They're not something that, for example, the Shannon entropy of something, you can hear the effects of noise on a channel, but you don't. It isn't. Entropy itself is not audible, right? And similarly, kind of you can see the effect of the rotting of a fruit, right? But thermodynamic entropy is not something you see or understand. It's not something at the macroscopic level. So then this is important because you've got this kind of difference between kind of the manifest level of experience, right, and the scientific description of the same phenomena, or the mathematical description. And this is why I think it's really helpful to turn to Seller's discussion of the manifest image of man and the scientific image of man. That's because noise refers to several different scales, phenomena, and several different levels of organization, so physical, semiotic, inferential, and it's defined relative to these different contexts. So Seller's distinction then is the manifest image is, so he understands it as the implicit conceptual framework in which man came to be a man in the world. But the image is manifest because it provides the framework for a person to passively suffer or experience, to conceptually think, and to rationally act in a world of manifest appearances, where a person is essentially defined by these three capacities, right? So perception, cognition, and action. The simplest way of characterizing the manifest image is to understand it as a common sense picture of the world. And Sellers often treats them as alike, but he's careful to stress that he's not opposing a basic naive image to a more advanced and mature one. So both images are global and, quote, essentially the same order of complexity. So the two images, though the two images clash, they're not in direct opposition. So the affirmation of one doesn't necessarily entail the negation of the other. So in fact, the manifest image develops and becomes more sophisticated in response to the incursions of the scientific image, which provides a competing total description while building on and implicitly maintaining many of the presuppositions of the MI. Right? So the scientific image develops from the manifest image and has many of its presuppositions. So the conceptual framework or logical space of the manifest image is the enabling condition for the critical reflection and evaluation of perceptual contents, thought and behavior. So it's the manifest image gives us the ability to give an account of the sensed environment and the movement of its parts according to rules and reasons. So obviously, the medium in which this occurs is natural language, generally. Or better still, socially embedded discursive rationality. But the manifest image shouldn't be conflated with language use, right? So, because on the one hand, you've got meaningful or semantically and logically consistent symbol manipulation is possible in cases where it's assumed the existence of a person or MI. So, for example, like a trained sentient creature or right. So, in this case, there's logically consistent symbol manipulation, but I think Sellers would argue that there isn't a manifest image. Sellers will argue that language as we know it presupposes the manifest image, right? So the manifest image is not language. It's presupposed by language. So the account-giving capacity of the person includes being able to distinguish between sensory and perceptual contents, right? So sensation from intention, and between concept and object, as well as to give explanations and to elaborate normative commitments. So the manifest image is articulated in many philosophical positions that presuppose some form of direct knowledge, whether this foundation is conceived as purely intellectual, purely sensory, or in terms of their lawful correspondence. But Sellers argues that this is not a necessary feature of the view from the manifest image. So much of the conceptual framework of the manifest image is carried over into the scientific image and forms the guiding assumptions of that. Right? So the logical space of the scientific image and
sorry, you said
and
you said the logical space of scientific image is, and there was a break, and I think it's crucial to get this sentence.
It's dependent on the implicit conceptual framework of the manifest image. Okay, so basically the manifest image will give you, the manifest image gives us the idea of, for example, persons, acting and capacity to connote things in our perceptual experience, right? So the scientific image relies on the payment of the manifest image, right? Even if some parts of it kind of tend towards superseding it, right? So, for example, in eliminative materialism, you get this kind of belief that the scientific image can kind of do away with the manifest image, right? So as Sellers describes it, the emergence of conceptual thought.
Could I interrupt for a second, just for clarification? Is this kind of like what in literary theory was talked about, and philosophy was talked about in terms of scienticity, like Sayre's notion talking about metaphors, that science metaphors have power, they take up space. So when one utilizes a scientific concept to explain real world issues, it has an ideological as well as a descriptive function.
Yeah, I mean,
you know what I'm talking about in Michel Serres. He talks about, you know, scientific metaphors and the fact that they are the power couple, so to speak, of communication in the modern epoch.
But Martin, that's more like a critique of scientific metaphors, right?
Well, it's not a denigration of scientific metaphors. It's an observation of how much more powerful scientific metaphors when compared to any other attempt to model something.
Maybe if I talk about how I summarize Sellar's manifest versus scientific image, it can help a little bit. Do you mind?
I think that would be really great.
Coming from the world of culture and art, I mean, I guess it's not that far from where Inigo enters it, but
it's the same for me.
Yes. First of all, the essay is a seminal essay, and it's very it's not that hard to get into, and I'm sure it's part of the reading material, and it's available as part of the Dropbox. And if not, I can post it to.
I put it on there already. Yeah.
What's the name of the article again?
It's called Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. If I'm correct.
It's in the book called Science, Perception, and Reality.
It's
the first chapter.
It's an important lecture from
the first chapter of the book.
It's an important lecture from 1960. Sorry.
So philosophy and the scientific image of man.
That's right. It's an important lecture from 1960, if I'm not wrong, and then it was turned into like the first chapter of the book. But basically, the way I describe it or summarize it is that manifest image is there's many levels to it, because he describes it historically as like manifest image is something that historically comes to humans first, because they don't really have that much scientific tools. But at a very at an ontological level, which is not say just like if we bracket out the history of the development of epistemology, manifest image relies upon an intuitive and direct access to the world, which is basically phenomenological. And basically, this is a description of the world by human, which is centered around human. It's kind of like myopic that way, and it's based on our perceptual access to the world. Whereas scientific image is an alien view that comes much later with the development of scientific method and scientific inquiry. And it's a multiple image, because it comes from many different scales and many different fields, and basically forms a complex multi-dimensional image of a phenomena that goes way beyond the phenomenological or the one that's accessible to humans on a very direct and basic level. So this is, but as Inigo was saying, scientific image is still rooted in the problems that were questions that were asked with a manifest image paradigm. So it's not really separate, even though for some it is. You can do away with completely with the manifest image. And basically for Sellars, the role of philosophy and consequently art is somehow build a bridge or create a sort of like a bit binocular that will always put these two images back together, because only by uniting these two that we can have a proper understanding of the world.
Yes, so he wants to try to overcome their opposition, right? And like I mean, actually one of the I think one of the things that kind of he's inspired by, I forget the name of this philosopher now, who talked about a scientific table and a manifest table, right? So he said there's a scientific table is composed of atoms, and the table which I see is not composed of atoms, right? I don't see any atoms. So there's a scientific description of the atomic composition of that, and then how do you square that with the experience that I have, right? These have no color.
Yeah, this is so interesting.
Atoms have no color. They don't have any hardness. How are you going to explain the two? Do you want to say something here? Martin?
Well, I was just really struck because I was at a philosophy of jazz conference last summer, and there was a Salarzian there named Robert Kraut, who's written actually quite a bit on music, and he was laying out this distinction in a really interesting way with respect to emergence, and so I was just struck by that. I was just going to mention. So this is a really interesting connection to me and current for me, and I'm really happy to. I'm going to go read that essay. That's really great.
Great. I mean, I think maybe say it like this as well. I mean, Sellers doesn't talk about this explicitly, so far as I know, but I think the manifest image is something that humans have, right? Animals have a manifest experience, but they don't have a manifest image of the world, right? In the sense that they don't have, they may see it, they will have a manifest experience of a table, for example, but we have a manifest image of a table, which is something different, right? And so this is why there's a kind of paradox. And so how did we first understand ourselves as persons if we didn't know, if we weren't already persons, right? This is the paradox for him. So a person must go on.
I was just going to say that what I was saying earlier with respect to Serre's discussion of metaphor is that scientists want scientific images to have the unquestioned immediacy of manifest images, and that's the power relationship here that Serres was trying to critique. I think I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, or whether you think I'm off base there.
Well, it's something interesting you're saying, because maybe we can modify what you say and then move on, because I don't know what Inigo wants to get into for the half an hour rest of the class.
Yeah.
But maybe it's not that the scientists want the scientific image to have the sort of legitimacy, the immediate legitimacy of manifest image, but they try to find ways to, unsuccessfully most of the time, to make that complex image available.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and we can put it aside how these function ideologically another time, and so thanks for that. I think that's really good.
No, but there's the way I deal with the political issue here is that say the thing is, and why the two are needed, and I mean, Inigo, you can totally tell me, Mo, your example is bad, and we're gonna just like erase it, right? And I'm happy with that. But it's like saying, for instance, like through scientific inquiry, we will get to say, for instance, a cure for HIV. But it's only through that kind of like manifest humanist understanding of what human is that we can make it available to millions and free healthcare. Because scientific inquiry itself is unable to do both.
Yeah, I wouldn't reject that. I think that's a good example. Yeah. But yeah, so let me just explain a little bit more the problem or the difference here, right? But so I was talking about the paradox of how the manifest image comes about, right? So know themselves in order to encounter themselves, and encounter themselves in order to know themselves, right? So but what appears from the manifest image to be an irreducible discontinuity is, from the point of the scientific image, a reducible difference. So, i.e., it's explainable in evolutionary terms, right? So that paradox doesn't exist for, although it's difficult to explain that in evolutionary terms, like how did we come to be, how did we come to be persons, right? But effectively, there's no kind of unbridgeable hiatus there, right? So in as much as the scientific image is able to give an adequate explanatory account of the emergence of the manifest image in terms of natural science, it need not maintain this kind of folk psychological framework as an implicitly assumed structural condition. So Seller's argument is that while we must look to natural science and evolutionary theory for an explanation of the emergence of reasoning from more primitive forms of cognition, so therefore their causal continuity, the truth of this discontinuity must be articulated from within the space of reasons and the perspective of the synoptic fusion of the two images, right? So this is where he puts forward the kind of claim that we have to have a stereoscopic fusion of the manifest and the scientific images in order to understand how we came to be what we came to be. So Sellers explains that the increasing sophistication of the manifest image has both an empirical and a categorical dimension. So where categorical is understood as a naturalized interpretation of Kant's transcendental categories. So this is why he's a transcendental philosopher. So he specifies that the empirical dimension of the manifest image is what he calls correlational induction. Okay, so by correlating the behavior of this cat with that cat, we can understand the concept cat, right? This is how the manifest image develops via correlational induction. Whereas the scientific image works via a procedure of postulational induction, right? This is the core difference between the two images. So the construction of the scientific image rests on the postulation of chaotic yet predictable swarms of imperceptible entities. So atoms, electrons, photons, phonons, etc. Right? So for the explanation of the observable behaviors, whilst the manifest image is a sophisticated treatment of naturally observable objects according to the correlation of their manifest sense perceptible properties. So this is really the fundamental thing is between observable and unobservable properties, right? So I mean, Sellers notes that this treatment, so correlation and induction also includes procedures such as extraction of lawful regularities through statistical inference at the level of populations, just as the scientific image does at the level of microscopic imperceptibles, right? So we've got, it's not like there's a difference here between the scientific image is statistical and the manifest image isn't. One of them is operating on observable statistical level and the other one is operating on the postulation of unobservable statistical populations. So
thank you. That's so useful. Thank you.
So yeah, so one of the founding moments of the formation of the scientific image, which is Boltzmann's postulation of statistical effects occurring at the atomic level, is inspired by the Darwinian treatment of population dynamics within the manifest image, right? But Darwin's science is really correlational induction, right? And Darwinian science itself is modeled on the Scottish Enlightenment understanding of economics as a self-regulating system occurring at the level of populations, and the new applications of the mathematics of probability indicated by Hume's philosophy. So the categorical dimension of refinement, right, the transcendental level, refers to the basic elements presupposed by the image and the corresponding classificatory schema. So the scientific image is, according to Sellers, fundamentally concerned with explaining the world according to the predictable movement of particles. The primary objects of the manifest image are persons and their character. And Sellers takes great pains to distinguish the notion of character from predictability. So a possible misinterpretation should be cleared up here. So to treat something as a person is not the same as to infer the existence of a spirit or mind that would inhabit the body as its ghostly double. So in fact, according to Sellers, the development of such a composite image of man, so mind-body dualism, is predicated on the more originary development of the holistic notion of persons, which is the manifest image. So the divisions that traverse the manifest image pertain to what is and isn't characteristic of the person, and what's deliberate as opposed to what's habitual in their actions. So none of these distinctions are determinable in terms of the opposition between predictability and unpredictability. To act deliberately for Sellers is to be able to give an account, at least in principle, from within the space of reasons as to why this behavior rather than that behavior was engaged in. So Sellers argues that the movements of an earthworm can only be metaphorically conceived in terms of habit or deliberate action, since only a being capable of deliberation can be said to act either impulsively or from habit, right? This is why the manifest image is something completely different, right? So it's people, persons who suffer, act, and think according to the manifest image, right? And of course, this gets tricky when we're talking about kind of ethical issues and like, the possible kind of, sapience of other animals. Certainly there are hugely intelligent animals, and, there's a gray area about, in making that distinction. But really, Sellers' distinction is based on the kind of the formal difference that is introduced by having a rational language, basically. So, framework of the manifest image is a refinement of the original image of an original image in which all objects are understood as persons. This is his kind of his mythical understanding of the development of it. So and this sounds kind of like a primitive animistic impulse, right, in the basis of the manifest image. But Sellers maintains that it shouldn't be seen as a non-scientific or unsophisticated or superstitious. So the idea, he says that the refinement of the manifest image, which is like its originary development, is that of depersonalization of objects. Right? So first of all, we understand objects in terms of persons, and then we depersonalize those objects. Right? And you can see this in like the worship of trees and stuff in paganistic religions. Right? So this results not merely in a change of belief, but a change in category. right? So this is the transcendental dimension, which is more radical transformation, according to Sellers. Now, it's important to note as well that for Sellers, both images, the scientific image and the manifest image, are idealizations, right? You know, they don't really, you know, they're both. We're characterizing a split, which is much more complex than that split actually is, right? So, that the difference is much more complex than we can characterize with these two kind of clunky images, right? So, but he compares the practical nature of this idealization to things like in physics, like the supposition of frictionless bodies, right? So it's a useful initial approximation that will allow for greater precision as we go on. So he also makes it clear that, you know, as Mo was saying, there's several scientific images, right? So there's not just one, you know, it's a multiple thing. So there's like, you know, there's a biochemist, there's a scientific image that is couched in the language of biochemistry, and one that's couched in a language of atomic physics, and so on, right? And you know, but Sellers argues in the long run, it should be possible to telescope them into one another. And you know, this is a contentious point, and I think you can argue. I mean, I think Sellers was actually wrong with this, you know. So, and Longo is quite kind of clear that at the moment it's not possible to kind of telescope many of those languages together. So we don't have a unified description of the scientific image. We have a multiple possible languages, and they're describing different aspects of the scientific image. So the sense in which there's the plural scientific images are able to form a single scientific image is predicated on the consistency it borrows from the manifest image on which it's built. So there's no such, this is a quote from Sellers, there is no such thing as the image of man built from postulated entities and processes. The scientific image is a construct from a number of images, each of which is supported by the manifest world. So Sellers considers the articulation of the manifest image to be not only the central project of ancient and medieval philosophy, but also contemporary continental thought and British and American common sense philosophy. Also, the manifest image is also endorsed as real. So the manifest image is considered the true global image, and the scientific image is capable only of filling its local details by what Sellers calls the perennial philosophy. And so perennial philosophy tries to say, you know, the manifest image is true and scientific image is just this detailed account of local effects, right? And this is, he says this is a long tradition beginning with pre-Socratics, Plato and Aristotle, and here's the exemplary philosopher of the scientific image, of the manifest image, according to Sellers, and it's developed by Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Husserl, and Wittgenstein. Right? So all of these people, according to Sellers, are attempting to assert the reality of the manifest image and the relativity of the scientific image.
You know, it would be interesting to sort of like explore this telescopability a little bit, yeah, from Lungo's position and from Sellers, because you know, another way to sort of like maybe that job is not something that is that is left to scientists but to philosophers, who, or some other type of or cybernetics, for instance. Cybernetics can be seen as a kind of like a tool that has the ability to telescope these different scientific images, because it somehow unites them, or at least like in earlier time, you know what, people thought of cybernetics as this meta scientific language that will unite all sciences through certain sort of like assumptions about like all this other stuff that we talked about earlier. I don't know what is what you think about that.
Okay, well, firstly, I'd say, oh wait, this is, so I don't think it's the job of philosophers alone. I think it's the job of scientists and philosophers. It's not the job of scientists alone either, to unify these theories. It's and yeah, cybernetics. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's for sure. Look, that work has to happen at the scientific level as well. I mean, you know, and for example, I mean, one of the things Longo talks about is, say, like how fluid dynamics, you know, so ideas such as turbulence, just we can't explain them in terms of atomic, you know, statistical mechanics. They have two different languages. So there's you know, this is why. And he's got an anti-reductionist position. So, and he thinks, you know, we ought to try to unify science, but that science is not unified, right? And maybe it's not even possible to unify those, right? Now, as to the status of cybernetics in that, I don't think it's the relevant theory actually as the one, you know. So the 20th century gave birth to a number of kind of generalizing theories, right? So just cybernetics being one, information theory another, like then you got general systems theory, dynamic systems theory, etc. Right? All of these attempt to explain a broad range of phenomena under a single language. Right, but cybernetics is quite particularly related to goal-directed behavior, and so it's not useful for a unification of those diverse phenomena, I don't think, and really it's there are problems with the original framework, I'd say. I mean, what has been more capable of doing that is information theory. So people like, for example, Laderman and Ross will argue that, you know, for a generalization of information theoretics as the basis of all science.
I apologize for using them interchangeably, but that's really somehow what I meant by cybernetics is like an amalgamation of system theory and information theory and sort of like later orders of cybernetics that is aware of those.
Yeah, right. I think
contributions.
I think in that case, yes, you're right. There's certainly a generalizing capacity in those developments. So information theory, cybernetics, general systems theory, and so on, which enables the explanation of, you know, basically we can give an information theoretic treatment of most of those naturalized understandings of scientific phenomena, right? But I think there's a problem when we bring that up to the level of normative linguistic logical conceptual thinking, and, you know, information theory, cybernetics, general systems theory just doesn't get there. What you're going to need there is to treat that at that level, right? So you need to you can't explain, again, you know, we can go back to the concept of cat or noise, right? You know, you can't explain, you can't just give an information theoretic compression of that idea, and that's the end of it, right? Because, you know, the way that concept works in inferential relations with other concepts is not going to be reducible to it. So it's logically irreducible, even if it's causally reducible.
Thank you. I mean, we can discuss this in later sessions too, because but I don't want to like dominate the last 10 minutes of the class. So
no, for sure. No, and I just wanted to say, if like the argument that I've just said in the last 2 minutes, that this idea of the information theoretic generalization in science and the limitations to that is very well explained in a piece by Daniel Sakilotto on Glassbead research platform, which is called A Thought Disincarnate, and I very much recommend reading that.
I didn't know Daniel contributed to the research platform. It's very good, and I would totally check it out. I love his work, and I've been trying to get him to also like maybe like organize a seminar for us in some later future, like sometime in 2019.
That would be great. Yeah, I mean, he's incredible, and really, I'd say, it's one of the, well, that piece by him, I think it effectively kind of tells the core part of what I'm trying to argue in my book in a very short way.
Definitely, if you don't have it as part of the reading, I will post it to the classroom.
Yes, I will post a link for it. Yeah,
I think it's easy to find, right? If it's on Glassbead.
Yes, if you just go to the research platform, then you'll find it.
He's such a brilliant scholar.
Yeah, it's great. So, anyone got any other questions or comments before we finish?
I just want to say that, like, for next class, let's just expect that other people will be familiarizing themselves with the readings and will come with some arguments and questions, because this will definitely enrich the environment of the seminar and also the recording of the video. But since the material is very heavy, I think it was okay that we allowed you to lead the class in the first session to provide the framework. But really, it's expected normally. I mean, it depends, because some instructors take up 2 hours of every session because there's so much material they want to cover. But it's normal to expect participation by the students and expect them to engage the readings and come back with some kind of formalized response or question. So I'm saying that sort of like trying to like hint at the people who are silent today in the class, especially people from diverse fields like law or other places, somehow kind of like bring stuff to the table. It would be amazing.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if I think the more interaction and questions and feedback we get, the better I can explain myself.
I think Mark, there's a question about what is the specific reading for next week. That's Eduardo asking it.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I would say it's probably useful to. I mean, I just with this Sellers. I think it would be useful to read that essay on the manifest image. That's going to be helpful. So I'd say that would be the main thing. What else we got? Yeah. Then.
Yeah, assigning a specific readings really help, because everybody doesn't have the time to like read everything all at the same time. So it's good if you can suggest 1 or 2 of the readings. I mean, the Sellers one is so like compressed and can be unpacked that like it's enough. But if you want to suggest other texts, it would be lovely to know.
Basically, after Sellers, what we're going to go into is a more of a discussion on thermodynamic entropy and so more of the details on that. And I suggest reading paper I put by
I lost that.
Yeah, like I didn't also understand which paper you mean for thermodynamics.
Yeah, it's called, let me see where it is. Information versus entropy versus probability.
And who is that by?
Schenker.
Oh, okay.
So Olli Schenker, yeah. And I mean, it's quite short. The book by Hemo and Schenker is great if you want to, if you've got more time. But yeah, this piece by Olli Schenker, it's readable if you want
Okay,
to do that.
So yeah, so I guess these two will be the readings for next week.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah. Good.
So would you characterize how you proceed as an attempt to negotiate the relationship between the manifest and scientific image of noise?
Yes, I want to develop a synoptic conception of noise. Exactly.
Which attempts to fuse.
Exactly. I mean, it's tricky, the word fuse. I mean, there's one theorist who argues that that fusion is not the right word, and that integration is the better word. I mean, the problem with, like, basically Seller's argument is that what you want to do is to put those two images together in a way that doesn't one image or the other, right? And so
they enter. In other words, they enter into mobile relationships with each other.
Yeah, let's say like that. So yeah, I mean, this is why he says stereoscopic. So you should be able to see a unified image through both of those channels, right? But you know, the problem is that most often what you're going to get is one of the eyes dominates, right? so you'll get a kind of what appeared to be a fusion is just dominated by the manifest or the scientific. So
right.
If the trick is how to preserve the essential insights of both of those images.
They're separate integrities.
Yeah. I mean, and also that paper by Daniel Sacalotto is totally great, and if anyone has a chance to read that, I recommend it too.
So Daniel's paper will be like an optional paper.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, but the link is here, and I will post the sidebar notes to the classroom so people can access the link from the classroom if they don't grab it right now before we close the session.
Yeah. And
I was going to say, yeah, go ahead.
There was one question right at the beginning about a text that I mentioned. Was it Tegan? How do you pronounce your name again? Tegan. It says, what was the title? The audio seemed to cut out. That was a while ago, so I'm not sure. But I guess that was right at the beginning. It was probably Uno. So yeah, there's this it's called A Nonlinear World by Uno. I think that was the one.
How do you spell the last name?
O-O-N-O.
Thank you. That's also on the sidebar.
Okay. Okay, so good. So see you all next week.
I guess see you next week, same time, same place. Yeah, let me just stop the broadcast, but I would like to just talk to you maybe. So thank you everyone, and sorry for the lack of video this time. I'm just gonna turn the video on for a second here to sort of say goodbye and get some image going at the very end. Yeah, so see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, cheers.